Thank you to be invited for this meeting here in Colombia. I'd like to talk today about the following topics, like, the relationship between climate, particularly heat exposure and pregnancies, and the potential role of micronutrients to mitigate some of these effects. So my presentation will be I will start with the nutritional and health challenges in low middle income countries. Then I will look into the trends of heat exposure. Then I will go into the heat exposure link and pregnancies. Then finally, I will talk about the potential role of micronutrients in mitigating the impact of heat exposure. And I will come to my conclusions. I will start with the fact that there is still a major issue for low middle income countries, and that's of course, economic growth. The World Bank came out a couple of years ago with a very important observation that many of the low income countries and a couple of middle income countries actually didn't do as well. And when they analyzed that, actually one of the key issues was in fact that the human capital of that country was not optimal. And they analyzed the data and they showed in fact that the children who are stunted and education and health of children are critical for in fact what they call the human capital index. And a good human capital index was critical for economic growth. So one of the things we realized is that, a problem which we are dealing with a lot in health is in fact low birth weight, small for gestational age, many different aspects happening during childhood, which actually will lead eventually to stunting and to other problems during childhood, which actually can lead again to a lower human capital. Interestingly, a very important paper from Ashorn came out a couple of years ago, like 1 year ago. And what they proposed, this group of people said, okay, we need to come up with a new term, because in fact, most of these things are, we are not effective in our programs because we have so many different terminology that in fact is very confusing for in fact public health and for practitioners, particularly you're looking at hospitals, you look at and it will be better to start to work with one particular terminology. And they brought in the term small vulnerable newborns. And the reason why in fact you have so many small vulnerable newborns and the problem has not been actually tackled as much as if you look overall in malnutrition, which has been declined. And this actually is still actually at a level which is a major public health problem, is that maternal nutrition is very critical. You have environmental exposures. The maternal health conditions are critical, but also socioeconomic and cultural factors. And of course, the health system factors. The other point is that in a couple of papers, I think there were 3 papers came out in Nature last year, and they were very interesting because it was funded by the Gates Foundation. They had all the experts who were part of many of these papers, and they were interesting in saying, okay, what is actually really the cause of wasting and stunting and the combination of both? And they used all the data sets to analyze in a much more depth way, a kind of meta-analysis, but meta-analysis from a different perspective. And what they found out is in fact that the preconception is actually critical. So we know about the 1,000 days, and we know it from conception to 2 years of age is a critical period. But in fact, these papers showed that in fact it's already too late during conception. So the preconception is a critical component of it. And many, there are very few programs in the world tackling the problem of pregnancies, pre-pregnancy, women as well as adolescent girls. So in the whole context of the risk of SVN, it's interesting the role of micronutrients. And micronutrients have multiple impacts. It, of course, improves the maternal nutritional status independent of the pregnancy. It reduces stillbirth, it address specific deficiency, and it has potential also long-term benefits. And it's a very cost-effective intervention. The reality is, though, that there are only a few programs in the world which actually dealing with the supplementation during pregnancies and pre-pregnancies. And many of the studies which were critical actually was looking at the pre-pregnancy, the start of supplementation. And it's very unclear why this is so difficult to do, but it's something we here at Hopkins trying to address, in many different ways. But programmatically, despite the evidence, it's not actually working in the most optimal way. So let me look at what's happening with ambient temperature over the past decade. And you could clearly see from this graph here is that there is, despite the annual fluctuations, there is an increase of the global mean temperature. And we all also know that, of course, that's part of the climate change. And it's from, the 60s, you can see, well, it's actually early started in the 20s, but from the 60s, very clear. It's almost like a linear trend of increase of temperature. So if you look at the future projections by WMO, we can expect, well, we don't know exactly, what in fact the endpoint will be, but we can expect at least 1.9 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. What is not so much known is that, yes, we see a steady increase of temperature, which has many consequences, of course, for agriculture, for different elements. But on top of it, you also have more extreme weather events, including heat waves. Heat waves, so you have the absolute temperature will go up, as well as the fluctuations in temperature. And many of the low and middle income countries are becoming uninhabitable, because particularly if you look at around the equator. We have seen in the past years like heat waves, extreme heat waves in Pakistan, in India, and many other places. Of course, we have seen it also in Europe, but let alone in those places which already, are exposed to much higher temperature during the summer. Even in Colombia, the World Bank comes out with, very good reports about every country. And Colombia showed that we have seen an increase in temperature and extreme heat exposure. And the situation will be definitely different. This is also very interesting. It's not everywhere the same. So like at the coastal area, you will have different increase in temperature than, for example, in the south. What's actually happening, during pregnancy? We have, of course, physiological changes in pregnancy. We see an increase in body mass and fat deposition. We see that, of course, the change of surface and area to mass ratio is changing. But we also have an increase in endogenous heat production. Not many people know that, in fact, a woman who's pregnant has about 0.5 degrees higher body temperature. And so the difference between, in fact, the heat, which would lead to many negative impacts, is much smaller than in a normal person. And there are also altered thermoregulatory pathways. the physiological consequences of heat stress, you know, what's happening during pregnancy is that, of course, a child needs optimal nutrients, and it goes through the placenta. So when, in fact, there is a little bit increase in temperature, ambient temperature, then there are many different mechanisms to compensate for the heat. But the moment the temperature becomes like higher than the body temperature, in fact, we as human beings have only one type of compensation, and it's in fact to bring the blood of our system to our skin, and so that we can sweat the heat out. But automatically, as a consequence of that, you will have less blood going to the placenta. And as a result of that, of course, less nutrients are going to the placenta, which actually leads to potentially an increase of the risk of low birth weight. On top of it, there are many other mechanisms like hormonal mechanisms, which actually makes the situation for the development of the fetus even worse. Another element, I don't know if I have the slide in my presentation, but it's very interesting that in human beings, this research looking into the effect of heat on pregnancies is relatively limited, and I will come back to that. But a lot of the knowledge we have is coming from animal studies. And the reason why, because we have, like in the US alone, there are on annual basis, millions, $100 million losses because of the impact of heat stress on the pregnancy outcomes in animals. And this is one of the reasons why I want to show you the number of publications. When I start to do a literature review on the topic as a preparation for a proposal we have written here at Hopkins, it's very clear that you look at 2004 to 2015, there are hardly any publication on this topic. But since 2015, you can see there is a quite increase in presentation, and even it's quite stable now until 2023. But I look at 2024, and again, I see an increase of the number of publications on this topic. So it becomes a serious matter, but I think the next slide shows you what's interesting is that most of the studies which have been carried out when I looked in until 2020, actually are coming from high income countries, from Europe, North America, and a bit of China. Very few studies actually have been carried out in lower middle income countries. It's increasing now. I've seen over the past year a little bit more studies from some from Africa, some from Asia. But it's very clear that the impact, which I will show you, is actually is there of heat exposure to pregnancy outcomes, but it's actually carried out in countries which actually have not, the women are not exposed as dramatically as what we can see in low, in the countries, the low middle income countries around the equator. So if you look at the impact of ambient heat on pregnancies, it starts like with reduced fertility. And of course, I know human studies looked into this. So all these studies are coming from animal studies. And for example, it's quite understandable that in many of the industry of the animal production, that fertility is an important component. What you see what we have seen in human beings already is like you see the placenta insufficiency, and I explained that it's because of the distribution of the blood going to the skin. You see congenital anomalies. We see spontaneous abortions. We see intrauterine growth retardation, preterm birth, and then so the outcome is low birth weight and stillbirth. But we also see, and this is again on the right side, after delivery, we have seen already infant mortality and morbidity. But what what you also have seen in animals is that we have diminished milk production and the altered breast milk composition. What's interesting about the diminished milk production, the impact of the heat exposure during the pregnancy is actually changes also the epigenetics. So they have shown in cows, for example, even 3 generations down the line, they still have a diminished milk production. Never, of course, studied in human beings. You know, this study came out in 2023, very interesting study from Shankar, and one of the few studies, actually, to me, my knowledge is it's the only study so far. And this group looked into, you know, like it's a result of a new analysis of the studies they have carried out, looking into the impact of micronutrients on pregnancy outcomes. And then they said, okay, but it's interesting because these studies are done in India and in Pakistan, and they looked into the impact of the maternal nutrition status and heat exposure on pregnancy outcomes. You can see that they had 3 different arms. They had an arm which receives comprehensive nutritional supplementation even 3 months for preconception, which is very difficult to do, but they did that. And then they had an arm when the women received the same supplementation, but from 12 weeks, which is quite normal. That's actually quite often when you can reach the women after 12 weeks, and then no supplementation. But you can already see from a practical perspective, it's not easy to, of course, to find women who are pre-pregnant. And this means, in fact, that from a programmatic perspective, you need to think very differently. You have to think about in certain countries, like, you know, when newlyweds, or you can say, well, we have to start with adolescent girls. But I will come back to that later. What the impact was of the study is that they found that higher ambient temperature in the first trimester was negatively associated with length and head circumference. And they also found that for each 5 degrees Celsius increase in the maximum daily temperature in the first trimester, the length decreased by 0.19 C-scores. And also so you could see that the impact on stunting was there. But what's more interesting is that the excessive heat stress in the first trimester was associated with the expression of genes. They looked into that. Down-regulated genes were enriched for processes related to protein translation and ribosomal biogenesis. The upregulated genes were associated with cellular responses to growth and nutrient transport. And key pathways affected, including actually the mTOR signaling and enfolding protein response. So there was a lot of the biochemical shift, which I didn't explain a lot in the beginning, but even so, underlying the effects of the much more biological effects, you had, in fact, biochemical effects at the level of the fetus and the mother. So the other aspect is that the preconception nutritional supplementation arm mitigates some of these negative effects of heat stress on birth length. And a significant negative association between the heat stress and low and length were observed in unsupplemented groups 2 and 3, but not in the preconception supplemented group. So you can see here, which is great that you have preconception supplemented group had a positive impact on the, could actually mitigate some of these effects of heat. The problem, of course, that I mentioned before is that from a practical perspective, it's very critical to reach them. And that's why you have to think from a program perspective, looking much more into the potential supplementation or potential improving the micronutrient status of women, adolescent women in general. So Overall, the study highlights the detrimental effects of heat stress on fetal growth, particularly in the third trimester. Improving maternal nutritional status through preconception supplementation can provide some mitigating effect against heat stress. And the findings underscore the importance of addressing both nutritional and environmental situations to improve maternal and child health outcomes in resource-limited settings. This is, I would like to end with a diagram which we have used for a paper we did as a background paper for a new series of studies in Africa on the cost of hunger. And what I want to show you is that if you look at the yellow part of the slide, of the diagram, you could see that if you have the vicious cycle of agriculture, food health and productivity is very important, because when we see there is a decreased human productivity, it has that would have an impact on the production of agriculture particularly in Africa, because 70% of the farmers, or 60%, depending on which data you use, are women, and the pregnancy is actually, there's a lot of the birth rate is quite high in Africa. So you could see that the exposure to heat on the pregnancies as well as to the health situation of women is actually could have a major impact, which has never been studied and never been actually included in the analysis. We know that agriculture workers in the US actually are at high risk for kidney diseases, and those are not even included, of course, in Africa or in Asia. But you could see here that it becomes even more complex. So in countries where we can expect that the heat stress will increase over the next decades, and top of it, the impact on the pregnancy outcomes as well as the epigenetic effect, if we don't start with active potential interventions at the different level, what I just mentioned, for example, micronutrient supplementation during adolescent years, then the vicious cycle will increase, and that we will have less production of food, not only looking at the quality of the food, which we also know will happen when you have heat exposure on the agriculture production, but also through the human beings. So in conclusion, I think rising temperature poses a significant threat to pregnant women and fetal development, especially in low middle income countries. The heat stress during the first trimester of pregnancy is linked to reduced birth length and head circumference, indicating potential negative effects on fetal growth. The study in Pakistan demonstrates that providing nutritional supplementation before conception can mitigate the adverse effects of heat stress on birth length. This research underscores the crucial role of addressing both nutritional deficiencies and environmental stressors to improve maternal and child health outcomes, especially in the face of climate change. The reason why I also mention environmental, potential solution is that we're also looking into the impact of white paint on roofs, because that may also reduce, 3-4 degrees of Celsius, and that could also have an impact on some of these outcomes. Interestingly, if you think about it, it's like people say, oh, like the air conditioning, of course, that will never be a solution, because that will be very bad for the climate too. So you need to find other ways to address it. Another element, because of the, which I didn't highlight, is the impact of heat is not only during the day, but also during the night. So during pregnancy, we don't know which time is actually the most critical. Is it, when they are in the field? That's definitely one of the impacts, but also during the night, because the nights are, particularly for pregnant women, are actually a more critical. Well, it's more a period also when they cannot sleep, and that will have also, all these consequences of other stressors. So nutritional intervention in adolescent girls and young women should be an essential component of government health strategies. And I know we're far away from that recommendation, but I think it's a critical, we have to re-study this and looking much more critical about the climate impact on nutritional outcomes. And another reason why, in fact, we have to step up interventions during adolescent times, not only actually in girls, but also in boys. So, but there's definitely a need for further research in low and middle income countries to understand the full impact of heat stress on pregnancy and develop effective interventions. Thank you.